used to believe my thoughts were my own, my private sanctuary that no one else could enter or control. But then I met Owen. He was charming in a subtle way, not the loudest person in the room, but the kind of man people seem to naturally gravitate toward. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why I found him so intriguing. Maybe it was the way he looked directly into my eyes when we spoke, as if he saw a secret in them that I didn't even know existed. Or maybe it was how he always knew what to say to make me feel important, valued, and frankly, a little bit special. In hindsight, there were red flags I should have noticed from the very beginning. A lingering stare that lasted a second too long, a gentle but insistent urge to tell him all about my life's troubles. He seemed so empathetic then. I was convinced I had found someone who truly wanted to listen. Little did I know, every piece of information I shared was being cataloged and stored, ready to be used later. Back then, my life was simple enough. Work, a few close friends, the occasional night out. I had my routines, my small joys, my sense of self. All of that was before Owen's influence started subtly weaving itself into every aspect of my day. If I had known what was coming, maybe I would have run. But at that point, I was already too captivated to see the danger ahead. Owen had a knack for making people feel special. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was a magnetism in his voice, a confidence in his stride. On our first official meeting outside of the group gatherings we both attended, I remember being strangely eager, my pulse quickening just at the idea of talking to him alone. He chose a quiet cafe, one that felt pleasantly removed from the busy city streets. That was his domain, intimate settings where his voice and presence could envelop you. He asked all the right questions. He wanted to know about my childhood dreams, my biggest fears, even my most embarrassing moments. It was all very subtle, as if he was just curious, eager to know the real me. I remember telling him about my father, how we were never close, and how I longed for a sense of guidance. Owen listened with rapt attention, nodding and offering small consolations. It felt good to be heard. I thought I'd found someone who genuinely understood me. Looking back, I realize how carefully he directed the conversation, never revealing too much about himself. Whenever I asked about his background, he offered vague glimpses. A difficult childhood, a few heartbreaks, some personal philosophies he claimed to have pieced together from reading a lot of psychology books. He'd share just enough to keep me intrigued, but not enough for me to truly know him. In that moment, though, I was too enamored by his attentiveness to notice the imbalance. Over the next few weeks, he integrated himself seamlessly into my life. He'd send thoughtful text messages. "How are you feeling today?" Or "Remember to take a break if work gets too stressful." These little check-ins brightened my day. They made me feel seen. Before I realized it, I was looking forward to them more than I cared to admit. Subconsciously, I began to adjust my schedule to accommodate his. If he suggested a late-night call, I'd stay up despite having an early morning meeting. If he wanted to meet for a spontaneous lunch, I'd rearrange my work tasks. I told myself it was because I enjoyed his company. But deep down, it was the start of a dependency, one that he skillfully cultivated. What made him so appealing was how he deftly mixed gentle praise with just a hint of criticism. For instance, he might say, "You have such a bright mind, you could do so much more with it," followed by a pointed question like, "Don't you ever feel you're limiting yourself?" He wasn't outright cruel, but these comments planted the seeds of doubt. Why was I limiting myself? Could I be doing more? Soon, I found myself consulting him about decisions that were once straightforward. Which project to focus on, whether I should attend a friend's birthday party, even what I should do on weekends. My friends initially teased me about my new obsession, but the teasing turned to concern when I started skipping social gatherings just because Owen suggested they were a waste of time. "You only have so much energy," he'd say in that calm, persuasive tone. "Don't spend it on people who don't truly value you." He never said it outright, but the implication was that only he truly valued me, only he really understood me. At work, I noticed myself daydreaming about our conversations. I jot down notes on ideas he mentioned or references he made. If he asked me a question about my personal goals, I'd spend hours analyzing it, trying to come up with an answer that would impress him. It was dizzying how quickly he became the focal point of my life. I hadn't thought to question it. I was happy, or so I believed. It felt like love, or at least something close to it. Beneath that joy, however, a quiet unease began to stir. I found myself justifying his small criticisms more often. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of something in his eyes, an intensity that bordered on predatory. But then he'd flash a disarming smile or utter a soothing reassurance, and I'd doubt my own instincts. He's just passionate, I told myself. He cares deeply, that's all. Still, I couldn't ignore the subtle shift taking place. My routines were no longer truly mine. My time, my thoughts, my aspirations, I noticed they were starting to revolve around him. The lines between my identity and his influence were blurring. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The charm, the attention, it was all too intoxicating. The tide of Owen's influence rose gradually, so smoothly that I scarcely recognized I was in danger. I'd tell him about an argument I had with a friend. He'd nod sympathetically, then ask, "But have you considered that maybe you provoked her reaction?" A tiny seed of doubt would sprout in my mind. Suddenly, I was the one doubting my own feelings, wondering if I was being oversensitive or melodramatic. He was there to guide me through every perceived misstep, offering his expert assessment of my behavior, my intentions, my entire personality. Where his real power shone was in gaslighting. It started in the smallest ways. One day, I mentioned a story he had told me about his family. He shook his head, feigning confusion. "I never said that," he insisted with a gentle laugh. At first, I thought he was joking, but he kept to his stance, his eyes unwavering, his tone calm. "You must have misunderstood," he concluded, placing the blame delicately on my interpretation. It was such a minor incident that I brushed it off. But then it happened again with something else, and again. I recall one night when I was feeling drained after work. I sent him a short text explaining I needed some space to decompress. He called me immediately, voice brimming with concern. "You told me yesterday that you hate being alone when you're stressed," he claimed. "Why are you pushing me away now?" In truth, I couldn't remember having said I hated being alone, at least not in the context he implied. But he sounded so certain. Maybe I had said it, maybe I just forgot. Soon enough, I found myself apologizing for being inconsistent. It seemed easier to accept his version of events than to challenge them. Owen's methods were insidious. His denial of reality wasn't loud or angry. It was soft, measured, and delivered in a voice that implied absolute conviction. He positioned himself as my guiding light, the only person who truly understood my flaws and wanted to help me fix them. He isolated me from my friends without making it seem like it was his idea. Rather, he pointed out how they weren't supportive or how they'd never truly get the new direction my life was taking. He meticulously stoked the fires of self-doubt, urging me to trust him instead, as if he were the only constant in a world that had become dangerously uncertain. This also extended to our social circle. If we were out with acquaintances and I expressed an opinion, he'd offer a gently contradictory viewpoint in public, making me look as though I were misinformed. Then in private, he'd say he was helping me refine my thoughts so that people would respect me more. It was embarrassing, but he reframed it like a loving correction. One Saturday night, we went to a small house gathering. I remember feeling uneasy the entire evening, like I was walking on eggshells. If I laughed too loudly, he gave me a subtle look that implied I was drawing unnecessary attention. If I fell silent, he'd nudge me and whisper that I was being antisocial. No matter what I did, it felt wrong. By the end of the night, I was anxious and exhausted. In the car ride home, he twisted the whole event in a way that painted me as an over-emotional child who needed his steady guidance. In those moments, I questioned whether I was losing my mind. Did I really overreact? Was I truly too loud, too quiet, too needy, too aloof? Every contradictory statement he made reinforced my confusion, until eventually I was too drained to challenge him. Instead, I found solace in accepting his narrative. After all, if he was right, maybe I could fix my flaws. Maybe then everything would finally make sense. Sometimes, timing changes everything. Just like subscribing to this channel seems to bring a surge of clarity in the most unexpected moments. At least, that's what I used to tell myself whenever I stumbled upon bits of wisdom or helpful suggestions. But back to the story. My world started to shrink around him. He was the sun, and I was just one of the planets, forced into a precise orbit that never deviated. Everything revolved around his needs, his opinions, his perceptions of who I was and who I should become. And yet, in the midst of this suffocating bubble, I kept clinging to the belief that he cared. Why else would he devote so much time and energy to me, if not out of love? But as the manipulation intensified, I began to see a side of Owen that was more overtly controlling. He wanted constant updates on where I was, who I was talking to, and what I was doing at every hour of the day. When I tried to set boundaries, like turning off my phone for a few hours, he'd accuse me of betraying his trust. He framed it as concern for my well-being, claiming that he worried about me. But there was an edge to his words that felt like a warning. Don't lock him out, or I would pay the price. My friends who remained began to sound alarms more urgently. They noticed I was losing weight, not sleeping well, and skipping out on things I once enjoyed. But I wasn't willing to break away yet. The fear of losing Owen was overshadowing the creeping suspicion that I was losing myself. The stage was set for a major turning point, one I never saw coming. The shift came late one night when I discovered something that took me entirely by surprise. I was at Owen's apartment, alone, while he'd stepped out for a quick errand. He trusted that I wouldn't snoop around. He'd spent months teaching me to doubt my own instincts, and he thought I was firmly under his thumb. But that evening, curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was a spark of self-preservation, finally roaring to life. I found a small notebook tucked between the cushions of his couch, one I had never seen before. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Pages and pages of neatly handwritten notes filled the book, each section labeled with dates and subheadings. My name appeared multiple times, surrounded by bullet points, details about my fears, my insecurities, the times I'd cried in front of him, the confessions I'd made about feeling unworthy. There were also references to psychological manipulation techniques, gaslighting, mirroring, isolation tactics, complete with little check marks next to them. My heart thudded against my ribs and my mouth went dry. It was all there, laid out like a twisted research project, my vulnerabilities exploited for a methodical strategy. I realized with a sickening lurch that he had planned this from the start. The charming persona, the feigned empathy, the subtle digs at my self-esteem, it was an orchestrated process, and I was his unwitting subject. In that moment, I wasn't sure what horrified me more, the extent of his deception or the fact that I'd fallen for it so completely. Every moment I'd confided in him replayed in my mind. The times I thought we'd had a genuine emotional connection, now they all felt like contrivances. I wanted to throw the notebook away, burn it, anything but keep reading. Yet I couldn't stop flipping through page after page of my own life dissected like some science experiment. I heard his key in the lock. In a rush, I slammed the notebook shut and wedged it back where I found it. My hands were shaking so violently I could hardly stand. By the time he walked in, I was perched on the edge of the couch, heart pounding, trying desperately to look normal. Little did he know, a crack had formed in the polished veneer of his control. And for the first time, I saw him not as a trusted confidant or a tragic hero, but as someone who had weaponized my entire life story against me. All night I lay next to him, feigning sleep while my mind reeled. That notebook changed everything. My perception of Owen, my own memories, everything felt tainted, like a facade peeled away to reveal a monstrous truth beneath. In the dark, I could sense him breathing steadily, as though nothing in his world had changed. But inside me, a storm was raging. The confrontation was inevitable. The next morning, we were in his kitchen. He noticed I was quieter than usual and asked if something was on my mind. My heart hammered. I contemplated lying, but the anger and betrayal were too strong to contain. As calmly as I could manage, I told him I seen his notebook. His reaction was swift and terrifying. One moment, he was placing a mug in the sink. The next, he had spun around, eyes wide with fury. "You had no right to go through my things," he shouted. The force in his voice was jarring. I had never heard him truly raise it in anger before. He grabbed me by the shoulders, and for a moment, I froze, shocked by the violence in his grip. I pushed him away, feeling both terrified and strangely resolute. "You've been tracking every fear I've ever told you," I said, my voice shaking. "You manipulated me, Owen. Do you think I don't see it now?" My words spilled out in a rush, a mix of rage and heartbreak. I remembered all those entries detailing how he'd twist my insecurities, how he'd systematically break down my self-esteem. He tried to spin it to make it sound like a misunderstanding. "You're overreacting," he insisted, his voice quieter now but still trembling with anger. "I was just studying how to help you. I've been reading about psychology, trying to be a better partner." But I saw through his lies. His face, once so composed, was now contorted, as though a mask had been ripped away. The gentle caretaker was gone. In his place stood someone who knew exactly how to manipulate others and took pleasure in it. He tried another tactic, flipping the blame onto me. "You invaded my privacy," he accused. "This is your fault. You never trusted me enough to let me help you." His words stung, because under normal circumstances I might have believed them, but not anymore. There was no going back to naivety. My tears streamed freely now, but they weren't just from sadness. They were from a deep sense of loss, loss of the relationship I thought I had, and loss of the illusions that had kept me compliant. "I trusted you," I hissed through gritted teeth, "and you used every piece of me for your own game." He lunged for me again, but I darted out of reach. Adrenaline coursed through my veins. "Don't you dare touch me," I warned, my voice trembling with both fear and newfound defiance. I could see the rage boiling beneath the surface of his gaze. For the first time, he seemed truly uncertain of his power. For a few heart-pounding seconds, we stared at each other. Then I grabbed my coat, my keys, and left. The door slammed shut behind me, echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. My mind spun, but one thought cut through the chaos. I would never return to him the same person I was before. And if I returned at all, it would be on my terms, armed with the knowledge of who he truly was. I stumbled out into the chilly morning air, feeling both liberated and utterly unmoored. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. Each time I glanced at it, I saw his name, but I couldn't bring myself to read them. My cheeks were still damp with tears as I hailed a cab. The ride felt surreal, like a transition between two entirely different realities, the one where Owen controlled my every thought and the one where I began to reclaim them. In the immediate aftermath of our confrontation, I was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. A part of me felt relief. I had proof now, tangible proof, that his carefully crafted persona was a lie. Another part of me was racked with guilt, wondering if I had somehow pushed him to this by oversharing my traumas. Yet logic told me I was the victim, not the instigator. He had preyed upon my vulnerabilities from the start, wrapping me in a cocoon of twisted devotion until I believed I needed him more than he needed me. I reached out to a friend who had witnessed my slow disappearance into Owen's world. She picked up immediately, relief evident in her voice. That same afternoon, she came over, and we spent hours talking, unpacking all the events of the past few months. I showed her the texts he'd sent me after I stormed out, a confusing mixture of apologies, anger, and pleas for me to not throw away everything we built. It was a perfect reflection of his manipulative nature, switching tones rapidly to find which angle might pull me back in. I blocked his number. Then I went to see a therapist, something I'd considered before but never had the courage to do. The floodgates opened during our first session. Words poured out of me, stories of gaslighting, subtle insults, the slow erosion of my identity. My therapist listened with compassion and validated what I'd been through. It was both terrifying and liberating to call it what it was: psychological and emotional abuse. In the days that followed, I was haunted by flashbacks of our relationship. I'd catch myself second-guessing my own memories, just as he had trained me to do. But every time, I reminded myself of that notebook, the clinical precision with which he had documented his exploitation. It served as proof, a safeguard against my own lingering doubts. Though I was shaken to my core, I felt a flicker of empowerment. The confrontation had broken the illusion. Owen was not an all-powerful figure. He was deeply flawed, hiding behind knowledge of dark psychology and manipulation tactics. And I was stronger than he ever gave me credit for. Over the following weeks, I focused on rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, apologized for my unintentional distance, and explained, at least in part, what had happened. Some took it personally at first, confused as to why I'd vanished so abruptly. But when I mustered the courage to open up, most of them showed me genuine understanding and compassion. Therapy became a regular part of my routine. Each session helped me reclaim pieces of my identity that I thought I'd lost forever. I began to see how Owen's tactics worked, how he systematically dismantled my confidence and replaced my instincts with his dictates. Awareness was my first step to healing. I started journaling too, documenting my real memories and emotions in my own words, so I could never again be convinced they were anything but the truth. At work, I found it easier to focus once the mental chatter of Owen's influence started to fade. I even took on a new project, a challenge I might have avoided in the past because he'd always made me feel inadequate. This time, I pursued it with a renewed sense of purpose. Every little success felt like a victory, not just at work, but over the hold he once had on me. I never confronted Owen again in person. He sent letters, emails, voicemails, each one oscillating between threats and pleas for reconciliation. Through my therapist's guidance, I recognized these as manipulative maneuvers to reestablish control. I had no intention of returning to that cage. Eventually, I moved apartments, changed my phone number, and took steps to ensure he couldn't easily track me down. Looking back, I realized that the hardest part wasn't severing ties with him. It was forgiving myself for not seeing the red flags sooner. But over time, I learned that blame wasn't mine to carry. Yes, I was vulnerable, but that didn't justify his actions. In the quiet moments, I found a sense of calm in acknowledging my strength, my resilience. I had survived his darkness and come out the other side with my sense of self intact. When I look back on my journey from the moment I first encountered Owen to the day I finally broke free, I see it almost like watching a hypnotic dance. In the beginning, the tempo was inviting, lulling me into a comfortable sway. Gradually, the pace grew more complex, each new step deliberately designed to trip me up if I wasn't perfectly attuned to his lead. By the time I realized I was no longer dancing to my own rhythm, my feet already ached, and I was lost in his choreography. In the early days, I told myself he cared. He listened so well, remembered the smallest details about my life, showered me with attention in a way that no one else had. That was the brilliance of his strategy. He identified my longing for genuine connection and wielded it like a master swordsman. Each compliment was a sharpened blade with two edges, one side drawing me closer with its sparkle, the other waiting for the perfect moment to cut into my insecurities. Long before I discovered his secret notebook, there were other ominous signs. The way he'd sometimes stare at me with a glint in his eyes that felt more like analysis than affection. The near imperceptible smirk he wore whenever I told him something vulnerable, as though he were mentally recording it for future use. But in those moments, I was trapped by my own hope. I wanted so badly for his interest to be genuine and pure that I rationalized away the disquiet in my gut. Gaslighting, in particular, was his crowning trick. Little by little, he taught me to question my own thoughts, memories, and perceptions. When he insisted he never said something that I clearly remembered, I'd find myself floundering, wondering if stress or emotional overdrive had muddled my recollection. When he claimed I'd done something I never recalled doing, I'd fold, feeling the weight of guilt or embarrassment, thinking perhaps I'd truly forgotten or suppressed it. He exploited the human mind's natural fallibility, twisting it so deftly that I sometimes thanked him for guiding me back to reality, his reality. And then came the isolation. Like a spider weaving a web around its prey, he'd gently discourage me from spending time with my friends, citing reasons that sounded almost protective. He'd hint that they didn't appreciate me, that they were jealous, or that they misunderstood my ambitions. With each small separation, he tightened his hold until my social world revolved around him alone. It's easy to see now how methodical he was. At the time, it felt like an inevitable progression, especially under the haze of his carefully administered emotional injections. The turning point, that moment I found the notebook, brought everything into horrific clarity. I sometimes ask myself what would have happened if I'd never stumbled upon it. How long would I have stayed under his spell, doubting every shred of intuition? Would I ever have woken up from his trance? The discovery rattled me to the core because it was incontrovertible. I couldn't deny the words on the page. They weren't subject to interpretation or my faulty memory. They were cold, hard facts, a chronicle of his deception in his own handwriting. Confronting him was like lighting a fuse. In an instant, he shifted from mild-mannered manipulator to a man cornered by his own lies. His anger exploded with a force that confirmed my worst suspicions. He never truly cared about my well-being. It was about maintaining control. The tenderness, the compassion, it was a carefully curated act designed to keep me malleable. His final attempts to reassert dominance, accusing me of violating his privacy, blaming me for prying, only reinforced how deeply he relied on rewriting reality. The aftermath was a gauntlet of emotional turbulence. I had to rebuild not only my social connections, but also my sense of identity. For a while, every decision felt shaky, as though I needed to double-check if it was truly mine or some echo of his influence. Therapy became my lifeline. With professional help, I retraced the steps of our relationship, naming each tactic for what it was: gaslighting, love bombing, triangulation, isolation. Labeling them helped diminish their power. It was like extracting venom from a wound. Seeking support from my remaining friends was another crucial step. At first, it was embarrassing to admit how thoroughly I'd been duped. I worried they'd judge me for being weak or gullible. Instead, most responded with empathy, though some were understandably hurt by my withdrawal. It took time to mend those friendships, to explain how manipulative relationships can quietly unravel a person's sense of self. Gradually, they came to see how expertly he'd orchestrated the entire scenario. Moving apartments and blocking him on every possible platform brought a profound sense of relief. Although it felt drastic, I needed that clean break. It wasn't just about physical distance, but about creating a space in which his voice could no longer reach me. I wanted to hear my own thoughts again, free from the persistent echoes of his criticisms and half-truths. Even so, healing didn't happen overnight. I had nightmares where I'd find myself back in his living room, leafing through that notebook, each page revealing new atrocities. Sometimes I'd dream that he confronted me, cornered me against the wall, and demanded I recant everything I said. In those dreams, I'd wake up feeling trapped and breathless, but each time I reminded myself, I was free now. Little by little, I reestablished my boundaries. I learned to trust my instincts again, to believe that if something feels wrong, it probably is. My confidence returned in increments, bolstered by small victories. A presentation at work that went smoothly, a reconnection with an old friend that reminded me of who I used to be before him. And as the months passed, the emotional scars began to fade. If there's one central lesson I've taken from this experience, it's this: manipulative people don't arrive in your life wearing a label. They often seem compassionate, perceptive, and devoted, exactly what you think you want or need. It's their skill at exploiting emotional vulnerabilities that makes them so dangerous. It's important to recognize the signs of manipulation: gaslighting, isolation, constant criticism disguised as guidance, and to seek help if you suspect you're in too deep. Nobody deserves to live under the heavy thumb of another's control. Recovery is possible, and you can reclaim the narrative of your own life. Remember, there is strength in reaching out for support, whether from friends, family, or professionals. And there is always hope, even in the midst of the darkest emotional traps.